Karl Marx was not born into poverty, nor did he begin life as a revolutionary. He was born on May 5, 1818, in the city of Trier, in what was then the Kingdom of Prussia. His father, Heinrich Marx, was a lawyer, educated and relatively comfortable, who had converted from Judaism to Lutheran Christianity in order to continue practicing law under restrictive Prussian rules. Marx grew up in a household that valued Enlightenment thinking, reason, and intellectual debate. He was not raised in hardship, but he grew up in a Europe that was changing violently under the pressures of industrialization, political repression, and social inequality. As a young man, Marx studied law at the University of Bonn, but he quickly drifted toward philosophy. He later transferred to the University of Berlin, where he became deeply influenced by the ideas of George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. Hegel's philosophy dominated German intellectual life at the time. Hegel argued that history unfolds through a dialectical process, a conflict between opposing forces that leads to transformation. Marx absorbed this framework, but he would later turn it upside down. At first, Marx was not focused on economics. He was concerned with philosophy, religion, and politics. He joined a group known as the Young Hegelians, who criticized religion and the conservative Prussian state. For Marx, religion was not simply belief in God. It was a symptom of deeper social conditions. He famously wrote that religion is the opium of the people, not as a simple insult, but as an observation that religion provided comfort in a painful world. To Marx, the problem was not faith itself, but the suffering that made people seek relief in it. After completing his doctoral thesis in philosophy, Marx struggled to find an academic position because of his radical views. Instead, he turned to journalism. In 1842, he became editor of a newspaper called the Rheinische Zeitung. Through journalism, he confronted political and economic issues directly. He wrote about censorship, poverty, and the conditions of peasants. His criticism of the Prussian government quickly brought him into conflict with authorities. The newspaper was shut down in 1843. This was the beginning of a pattern that would define his life. Exile. Marx moved to Paris, where he encountered socialist thinkers and revolutionary workers. It was here, in 1844, that he met Friedrich Engels. This meeting would change the course of his life. Engels, the son of a wealthy industrialist, had first-hand knowledge of factory conditions in England. He had seen workers living in extreme poverty while factory owners accumulated wealth. Engels shared his observations with Marx, and their intellectual partnership began. Marx's thinking began to shift decisively toward economics. He studied the realities of industrial capitalism, especially in Britain, which was the most industrialized nation at the time. Factories were expanding rapidly. Machines were replacing skilled labor. Workers were migrating from rural areas into crowded cities. They worked long hours for low wages, often in dangerous conditions. Marx asked a simple but powerful question: who benefits from this system? He concluded that capitalism was built on exploitation. In his analysis, workers sell their labor to capitalists in exchange for wages. But the value workers create through their labor is greater than the wages they receive. The difference between the value produced and the wages paid is what Marx called surplus value. This surplus becomes profit for the capitalist. In this way, Marx argued the wealth of the capitalist class depends on the extraction of surplus value from the working class. The system is not neutral. It is structured around class conflict. In 1848, as revolutionary movements spread across Europe, Marx and Engels published the Communist Manifesto. It opened with one of the most famous lines in political history: "A specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism." The manifesto argued that history is the history of class struggles. Slave and master, lord and serf, bourgeoisie and proletariat. The bourgeoisie, according to Marx, were the owners of the means of production, factories, land, capital. The proletariat were the workers who owned nothing but their labor. As capitalism developed, Marx believed it would create increasingly sharp divisions between these classes. Wealth would concentrate in fewer hands. Workers would become more alienated from their labor, from each other, and from themselves. alienation became one of Marx's central ideas. In pre-industrial societies, workers often saw the product of their labor from beginning to end. A craftsman created a full object. Under industrial capitalism, labor became fragmented. A worker might tighten the same bolt thousands of times a day without seeing the finished product. Work became repetitive and disconnected from personal meaning. According to Marx, this alienation was not just economic. It was psychological and social. The revolutions of 1848 ultimately failed, and Marx was expelled from several countries. He eventually settled in London, where he would live for the rest of his life in relative poverty. Despite his growing influence, Marx himself struggled financially. Engels often supported him with money from his family's business. In London, Marx devoted years to research in the British Museum reading room. He studied economics in detail, analyzing capitalism not just as a moral problem, but as a structural system with laws and tendencies. His major work, Das Kapital, was published in 1867. In it, he examined commodities, labor, value, profit, and the dynamics of capital accumulation. Marx argued that capitalism contains internal contradictions. It drives innovation and productivity, but it also creates crises. Overproduction leads to economic downturns. Competition forces capitalists to reduce wages and increase efficiency, which can reduce workers' purchasing power. This tension, he believed, would eventually destabilize the system. He did not see socialism as a utopian dream imposed from outside. He believed it would emerge from the internal contradictions of capitalism itself. As workers became more conscious of their shared exploitation, they would unite, overthrow the capitalist system, and create a society where the means of production were collectively owned. Marx did not live to see a large-scale communist revolution. He died in 1883, relatively unknown outside radical circles. But decades later, his ideas would inspire movements and revolutions across the world. The Russian Revolution of 1917, the rise of communist states in China, Eastern Europe, and elsewhere all drew heavily from his writings. Yet Marx's legacy remains complex. Some see him as a visionary who exposed the injustices of industrial capitalism. Others see him as the intellectual foundation for authoritarian regimes that emerged in the 20th century. His analysis of class, labor, and capital continues to influence economics, sociology, political theory, and cultural criticism. What cannot be denied is that Marx changed the way people think about power and economics. He shifted attention from kings and parliaments to factories and labor. He argued that economic structures shape political systems and social life. He insisted that to understand society, one must understand who owns, who works, and who profits. Karl Marx began as a philosopher influenced by abstract ideas. He became a critic of industrial society, and in doing so, he became one of the most influential and controversial thinkers in modern history. After settling in London, Karl Marx entered the most difficult and yet most intellectually productive period of his life. He was no longer a young radical writing fiery newspaper articles. He was a researcher, spending long days in the reading room of the British Museum, surrounded by stacks of economic reports, factory data, trade statistics, and philosophical texts. London at the time was the center of global capitalism. The British Empire stretched across continents. Industrial production was expanding rapidly. Railways connected cities. Factories multiplied. Wealth flowed through banks and shipping ports. But alongside this growth was extreme poverty, overcrowded slums, child labor, and frequent economic crises. Marx did not rely on emotion alone. He wanted to understand the mechanics of the system. He studied classical economists like Adam Smith and David Ricardo. He agreed with them that labor was central to value, but he believed they had not followed their own logic far enough. If labor creates value, he asked, why does the worker remain poor while the owner grows wealthy? This question became the foundation of his mature economic theory. In his analysis, every commodity has both a use value and an exchange value. Use value refers to the practical purpose of an item. A coat keeps someone warm. Bread satisfies hunger. Exchange value refers to what the item can be traded for in the market. Under capitalism, goods are produced primarily for exchange, not for direct use by the producer. The system revolves around profit. Marx argued that labor power itself becomes a commodity. Workers sell their ability to work for a wage. The wage is determined not by the full value the worker produces, but by what is necessary to keep the worker alive and able to continue working. This includes food, shelter, clothing, and basic needs. However, during the working day, the laborer produces more value than the cost of their wage. That extra value becomes surplus value, which is kept by the capitalist as profit. This is not theft in a legal sense. It is built into the structure of the system. The worker freely enters into a contract, but the conditions of that contract are shaped by economic necessity. Workers must sell their labor to survive. Capitalists own the factories, machines, and raw materials. Without access to the means of production, workers have no choice but to participate. Marx saw this relationship as inherently unequal. He described it as exploitation, not because of individual cruelty, but because of the structural imbalance between those who own and those who must sell their labor. He also introduced the idea of historical materialism. According to Marx, the material conditions of life, especially the mode of production, shape society's institutions, laws, politics, and even ideas. In earlier societies, such as feudalism, land was the central productive resource. Lords owned land. Peasants worked it. Political power reflected this arrangement. Under capitalism, industrial capital replaced land as the dominant force. Factories and machinery became central. Political systems evolved to protect private property and capital accumulation. In this framework, ideas are not independent forces floating above reality. They are connected to economic structures. This does not mean individuals are puppets without agency, but it does mean that large social patterns are influenced by material conditions. Marx believed that capitalism was historically progressive compared to feudalism. It unleashed productive power on a scale never seen before. It broke down rigid social hierarchies. It created global trade networks. But he also believed it would not last forever. Just as feudalism gave way to capitalism, capitalism would give way to something new. One of the central contradictions he identified was the tendency toward concentration of capital. Competition pushes businesses to grow larger, adopt new technologies, and eliminate smaller rivals. Over time, wealth and productive resources become concentrated in fewer hands. Meanwhile, workers become increasingly dependent on wages. This widens the gap between rich and poor. Another contradiction lies in crises of overproduction. Capitalism encourages constant expansion. Factories produce more goods than ever before. But workers whose wages are kept relatively low cannot afford to buy back all the goods they produce. This imbalance can lead to economic downturns, layoffs, and social instability. Marx saw these crises not as accidents, but as recurring features of the system. During this time, Marx also became active in political organizing. In 1864, he helped found the International Workingmen's Association, often called the First International. This organization sought to unite labor movements across national borders. Marx believed that the working class had common interests that transcended nationality. Capital operated globally, and workers needed solidarity beyond individual countries. Despite his intense intellectual output, Marx's personal life remained difficult. He and his wife, Jenny, faced financial hardship for years. Several of their children died young, a tragedy that deeply affected him. Engels remained his closest collaborator and financial supporter. Their partnership was unusual. Engels, though from a wealthy background, devoted much of his life to supporting Marx's work, editing his manuscripts, and promoting his ideas. Marx published only the first volume of Das Kapital during his lifetime. The later volumes were edited and released by Engels after Marx's death, based on extensive manuscripts. His work was dense, analytical, and not easy to read. It was not written as a simple political pamphlet, but as a detailed critique of political economy. As he aged, his health declined. Years of stress, poverty, and overwork took a toll. By the early 1880s, he was physically weakened. His wife, Jenny, died in 1881, and one of his daughters died shortly after. Marx himself died on March 14, 1883, in London. Only a small group of friends attended his funeral. At the time of his death, he was not a global icon. He was known in socialist circles, but he had not yet become a symbol of worldwide revolution. That transformation would come later. After Karl Marx died in 1883, his ideas did not disappear with him. In many ways, they were only beginning to move beyond small intellectual circles and into mass political movements. Friedrich Engels took on the responsibility of organizing and publishing Marx's unfinished manuscripts, ensuring that volumes 2 and 3 of Das Kapital were completed and released. Engels also worked to clarify and defend Marx's theories against critics and internal disagreements within socialist movements. By the late 19th century, industrial capitalism had expanded far beyond Britain. Germany, France, the United States, and other nations were rapidly industrializing. Urban working classes were growing. Trade unions were forming. Socialist political parties began to emerge across Europe. Many of these parties adopted Marx's analysis of class struggle as their foundation. However, Marx had not provided a detailed blueprint for how a socialist society should function. He focused more on critiquing capitalism than designing a future system. This left room for interpretation. Some Marxists believed change should come gradually through democratic reforms. Others believed revolution was necessary. In 1917, more than 3 decades after Marx's death, a revolution in Russia brought his ideas to global attention in a way he could not have imagined. Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks drew heavily from Marx's writings, though they adapted them to Russian conditions. Russia was not a fully industrialized capitalist society like Britain. It was largely agrarian, with a small industrial working class. Lenin argued that a disciplined revolutionary party could act on behalf of the proletariat and accelerate the transition to socialism. The Russian Revolution led to the creation of the Soviet Union, the first state officially organized around Marxist principles. For supporters, this was proof that Marx's theory had practical power. For critics, it raised serious concerns about how his ideas were being implemented. Throughout the 20th century, Marxism spread further. China's revolution in 1949, led by Mao Zedong, was also inspired by Marx, though Mao adapted the theory again, emphasizing the role of peasants rather than industrial workers. Communist governments eventually emerged in Eastern Europe, Cuba, Vietnam, and elsewhere. At the same time, capitalist nations were also changing. Labor movements in Europe and North America pushed for reforms such as shorter working hours, minimum wages, social welfare systems, and labor protections. Some historians argue that the presence of strong socialist movements pressured capitalist governments to address inequality more seriously. Even in countries that did not adopt communism, Marx's critique influenced debates about economic justice. Yet the 20th century also revealed the darker side of regimes that claimed Marx's legacy. In the Soviet Union under Stalin, political repression, forced labor camps, and widespread purges became realities. In China, policies like the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution caused immense suffering. Critics argued that these outcomes were not accidental distortions, but natural consequences of Marx's emphasis on centralized control of the means of production. Supporters countered that Marx himself had envisioned a classless, stateless society emerging after a transitional period. They argued that authoritarian leaders betrayed the spirit of his work rather than fulfilled it. This debate continues among scholars and political thinkers. Meanwhile, capitalism itself did not collapse as Marx predicted in the 19th century. It adapted. Corporations grew larger, but so did consumer markets. Technological innovation created new industries. Middle classes expanded in many countries. At the same time, economic crises continued to occur, including the Great Depression of the 1930s and the global financial crisis of 2008. Each crisis revived interest in Marx's analysis of instability and inequality. In academic fields such as sociology, political theory, cultural studies, and economics, Marx's influence remained strong even where communist politics declined. His concept of class analysis became a central tool for understanding power relations. His idea that economic structures shape social institutions influenced generations of thinkers. In the late 20th century, the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 led many to declare the end of Marxism. Capitalism appeared dominant and unchallenged, but inequality continued to rise globally. Debates about corporate power, wealth concentration, automation, and labor exploitation resurfaced in new forms. In the 21st century, discussions about gig economy workers, global supply chains, and multinational corporations often echo Marx's original questions. Who controls production? Who benefits from growth? Who bears the cost of economic crises? Marx's terminology may not always be used explicitly, but the structure of his analysis still shapes conversations about economic justice. Today, Karl Marx remains one of the most controversial figures in modern history. To some, he is a champion of the oppressed, a thinker who exposed hidden mechanisms of exploitation. To others, he is the intellectual source of political systems that caused immense suffering. His name is associated both with workers' rights movements and with authoritarian states. What is undeniable is the scale of his impact. Few thinkers have influenced politics, economics, and philosophy as deeply or as globally. His central claim, that economic structures shape society and that class conflict drives historical change, continues to provoke debate. Marx began as a philosopher fascinated by abstract ideas. He became an economist, analyzing the mechanics of capitalism. After his death, he became a symbol, a banner under which revolutions were fought and governments were formed. His life was marked by exile, poverty, intellectual struggle, and relentless study. He did not live to see his ideas reshape the world, but they did. By the time the 20th century came to a close, Karl Marx had become more than a philosopher or economist. He had become a permanent presence in global political debate. Entire nations had risen in his name. Entire systems had fallen while claiming to represent his vision. Yet beneath the revolutions, the slogans, and the statues, the core of his work remained a detailed analysis of how economic power shapes human life. To understand Marx's lasting significance, it is important to return to his central concern. He was not primarily writing about envy or resentment. He was attempting to understand structure. He believed that beneath political speeches and cultural traditions lies a material foundation, the way society organizes production. Who owns land? Who owns factories? Who controls capital? These relationships, he argued, determine the framework within which politics and culture operate. In modern capitalism, ownership has become even more abstract than in Marx's time. Corporations operate across continents. Financial markets move billions in seconds. Shareholders may never see the factories or workers connected to their investments. Yet the basic dynamic Marx described, ownership of productive assets, separated from those who perform labor, still exists. The scale has changed, but the structure remains recognizable. At the same time, the working class has evolved. In Marx's era, it was largely industrial factory laborers. Today, it includes service workers, logistics employees, software engineers, warehouse staff, gig drivers, and countless others whose income depends on wages rather than ownership. Automation and artificial intelligence have introduced new questions about labor's role in production. If machines replace human labor, how is value distributed? Who benefits from increased productivity? These questions echo Marx's original inquiry into surplus value and capital accumulation. Critics argue that Marx underestimated capitalism's adaptability. He believed that increasing concentration of wealth would polarize society into two main classes. While inequality has grown sharply in many countries, capitalist systems have also created complex middle classes, welfare states, and regulatory frameworks. These adjustments have delayed or reshaped the crises Marx expected. Yet periodic financial collapses, housing bubbles, and debt crises continue to reveal vulnerabilities within the system. Another area where Marx's influence persists is in the concept of ideology. He argued that dominant ideas in society often reflect the interests of the ruling economic class. Media, education systems, and political narratives may appear neutral, but they can subtly reinforce existing power structures. This perspective has shaped modern critical theory, cultural analysis, and political critique. However, Marx's legacy cannot be separated from the regimes that claim to act in his name. The centralized control of economies in the Soviet Union and other communist states often resulted in inefficiency, repression, and lack of political freedom. Planned economies struggled to match the innovation and flexibility of market systems. These historical outcomes have led many to question whether Marx's theoretical framework can function without leading to authoritarian concentration of power. Supporters respond by distinguishing between Marx's critique of capitalism and the specific political systems that later emerged. They argue that Marx envisioned a classless society where the state would eventually wither away, not a permanent centralized authority. The debate over interpretation continues among scholars, activists, and political leaders. What makes Marx endure is not that his predictions unfolded exactly as he imagined, but that his method of analysis remains powerful. He encouraged people to look beneath surface explanations. When economic inequality rises, he invites us to ask how ownership is structured. When workers struggle, he asks us to examine how value is distributed. When political decisions appear neutral, he asks who benefits materially. Karl Marx lived much of his life in obscurity and financial hardship. He spent years studying in libraries, writing manuscripts few initially read. He endured exile from multiple countries. He buried children lost to illness. He relied on the loyalty and financial support of Friedrich Engels. He died without wealth or widespread fame. Yet his ideas traveled further than he ever did. They moved through factories, labor unions, revolutionary cells, universities, political parties, and governments. They influenced constitutions and economic policies. They inspired both hope for equality and fear of centralized power. More than a century after his death, the global economy still raises questions he insisted on confronting. Why does productivity increase while wages stagnate? Why does wealth concentrate at the top? How should societies balance private ownership with public welfare? These debates do not require agreement with Marx to acknowledge his influence. They exist partly because he framed them so forcefully. Karl Marx did not simply criticize capitalism as unjust. He attempted to dissect it scientifically to reveal its internal mechanics. Whether one views him as visionary or flawed, reformer or instigator, his impact on modern thought is undeniable. He began as a student of philosophy in a small Prussian city. He became a critic of the most powerful economic system of his time. And long after his death in London, his name continues to shape arguments about power, labor, wealth, and the future of society itself.